Hey there. Tonight, we're going to step into a world of silence, stone walls, and sacrifice. A world where time moved slowly, where comfort was considered a sin, and where your days were measured not in joy or freedom, but in prayers, chores, and cold, echoing footsteps. We're diving into the harsh and hidden life of a medieval monk. Forget the peaceful images of monks quietly tending gardens or humming chants in candlelit chapels. The reality was far more difficult. Becoming a monk meant giving up everything: your name, your family, your future. From the moment you took your vow to the day you were quietly buried in the abbey graveyard. This is a life few truly understand, and even fewer could endure. So get comfortable, settle in, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Let's begin. You were expected to live without possessions, speak only when necessary, and punish yourself for even the smallest sinful thought. Meals were plain, sleep was short, and the cold always there. There were no warm hearths, no comforting words, and no escape. In this video, we'll uncover what it really felt like to live inside the walls of a monastery. The moment your foot crosses the threshold of the cloister, everything changes. There is no applause, no fanfare, just the cold hush of stone and shadow. Behind you, the world you knew begins to dissolve. The family you were born to, the name you were given, even the clothes on your back. You're no longer a son, a tradesman, a scholar, or a peasant. You're something else now, a novice, a soul set apart. It begins with the stripping away. Your hair is shorn in the tonsure, a visible ring of humility carved into your scalp, marking you as someone who has renounced pride and vanity. If the abbot asks you to scrub floors, you scrub floors. If he tells you to copy a manuscript in the dead of winter with numb fingers, you do it. If he tells you to rise in the middle of the night to chant psalms, even if your legs tremble and your head aches, you rise. The outside world was chaotic, violent, and unpredictable. Here, in these stone walls, was order. The monastery doors are not locked, but you know you cannot leave. The walls are thick and cold in winter, and during the summer, the stone sweats. It is reaffirmed every day, with every silence kept, every task obeyed, every indulgence denied. When the chant vibrates through your chest and lifts your spirit for a few fleeting seconds. When you stand in the cloister garden and feel the wind pass through the herbs you planted with your own hands. These moments are rare, but they sustain you. And when you are tempted, and you will be, by the scent of bread, by a memory of a soft voice, by a flash of laughter, you return to your rule. Your name, the one you gave up, will fade from memory. You'll see new novices come, trembling as you once did, and you'll watch them take the same vow. Some will leave. Some will fail. But others will remain and grow old here, as you have. You remember why you came: to seek God, to shed the self. A plain grave, unmarked, part of the monastery's soil. No grand epitaph, no family weeping at your stone. To find in the humblest acts of repetition some whisper of the divine. There are no distractions, no books for pleasure, no music save for chanting. If you are literate, you may eventually be asked to copy scripture by hand, a slow, painstaking task that could take months. If not, you might work in the garden or in the kitchen, performing the same tasks every day with a kind of reverence. Even weeding can be prayer, you are told, if done with the right spirit. And one of the brothers will whisper your name in prayer, not the name you were born with, but the one you earned. To walk away would be a spiritual betrayal, a return to the world, a kind of spiritual death. And so you remain, learning to accept your new reality. You rise before dawn, wash in icy water, and enter the choir for matins, the first of 7 prayers that will divide your day. In the city, you might starve, be robbed, or be drafted into war. Here, at least, you knew your place. Your meals came on time. Your prayers gave rhythm to your day. You were surrounded by men who are not concerned with money or status, men who, like you, had chosen a different path. A narrow path, yes, but one that promised peace. Not because you understand, or agree, or even feel spiritually moved, but because you have vowed to obey. The familiar tunic and belt you wore in the outside world are taken from you and replaced with the rough, undyed habit of the monastery. Scratchy wool clings to your skin, a daily reminder that comfort is no longer your concern. Speech is rationed, and small talk is discouraged. Words, like everything else, are sacred and should not be wasted. Instead, you learn to communicate in gestures, nods, careful glances. You speak when given permission. You do not complain, not even when your body aches from hours of kneeling, not even when you're hungry or cold or lonely. Complaints are the voice of the self, and the self, you are told, is the very thing you must crucify. There's no personal flair allowed, no colorful embroidery, no softness, just uniformity. You are one of many now. The ceremony itself is quiet and restrained. In some monasteries, you lie prostrate on the cold flagstone floor before the altar as the litany of saints is chanted over you. Poverty, chastity, obedience, the triple cords that bind your new life. You give up all personal possessions, signing away anything you might have inherited or owned. If you brought a book, a cup, a cloak, they are no longer yours. Even the pen you use or the bread you eat belongs to the community. Nothing is kept for yourself, for to do so would be theft in the eyes of the rule. It's a symbolic death, the death of the self. Even speaking too fondly of your old life, of a woman you once knew, of a sunset you once admired, can be seen as a slip. Temptation is not defeated in a single act. It is worn down over years of silence, repetition, and prayer. You're not asked to suppress your humanity, but to redirect it entirely toward God. Every affection, every longing must be channeled upward. When you rise again, you are no longer your own. Your name may even be changed, chosen by the abbot, or selected from a saint whose life you are meant to emulate. It is not unlike being reborn, except you are not born into freedom. You are born into obedience. Taking the vow is not one simple promise. It is a surrender of everything you once claimed. Chastity means more than avoiding marriage. It means learning to master your thoughts, to extinguish desire from the root. And then there is obedience. This is the hardest vow for many. You no longer make decisions for yourself. It's a vow not just of action, but of the will. Even your voice is no longer entirely yours. In many monasteries, novices are required to keep periods of silence, sometimes long hours, sometimes days. What's astonishing is that, for many who entered the cloister, this was not punishment but liberation. Yet peace is not always immediate. As the days pass, you feel the weight of what you've done. Your world has shrunk. Your cell is bare. A straw mattress, a wooden stool, a crucifix. The vow you took doesn't end with the ceremony. There are moments when this seems possible. When the light strikes the altar just right, years will pass. You'll stop wondering about the world outside. And when your time comes, when your body finally gives out from the cold or the years of kneeling, you will be buried in the very earth you tended. But within the monastery walls, the bell will toll. The first sound that breaks the silence is not the birds, not the rustle of leaves, not even your own breath. It's the bell. A single, low, groaning tone rolling through the darkness, like a wave across the stone floor of your dormitory. You're expected to move with discipline and reverence, even when your muscles ache and your mind begs for just a little more sleep. These bells don't just mark hours. They dictate your entire existence. Their tone is a voice from heaven calling you to the divine office, the sacred rhythm of prayer that carves up your day like a liturgical map. Talking is allowed only during designated times, and casual conversation is virtually non-existent. These aren't comfortable seats. They're narrow wooden benches, often unheated, their edges worn smooth by generations of worshippers before you. The space smells of wax and incense and old wood. The air is cold, colder still if it's winter, and you feel it biting your hands and face. You might be one of them. It's not considered a grievous sin to doze off, but it is embarrassing and frowned upon. Sometimes a more zealous brother will give a firm nudge with his elbow if you're caught nodding. These morning prayers are more hopeful than matins, often filled with praise and thanksgiving. The light is slow to come, but it always comes. It's a spiritual act. It says, I choose discipline over comfort, God over self. It's the beginning of every monastic day, and it never gets easier. You learn to live with exhaustion like a second skin. You learn to work through it, to pray through it, to carry it with you like a hidden stone under your robe. You return briefly to your cell, not to rest, but to prepare for the labor ahead. The real work of the day is about to begin. Copying manuscripts, gardening, caring for livestock, or helping in the infirmary. But none of that happens until you've paid your debt in prayer. They represent the coming of light, the anticipation of resurrection, even if the sun is still hidden. Your voice rises again, still hoarse from sleep, still cold in your throat, of belonging to something ancient and bigger than yourself. You don't smile, but your soul might. And then the bell rings again. You chant because you must, because the rule says to, because centuries of monks before you did the same. But others show mercy. They know the toll, but discomfort is a holy teacher. That's what you've been told. So you move in quiet procession with the others, shadows gliding through the dim corridors like a line of ghosts. Your voice joins the others, forming a somber chant that echoes off the stone walls. It isn't meant to be beautiful in the way a performance is. It's meant to be devotional, unearthly, stripped of ego. You do not return to bed. You might sit quietly in the cloister walk, a long covered passage that surrounds the garden. Or you might kneel in personal prayer. If you belong to an especially strict order, like the Cistercians or Carthusians, this time is for contemplative silence, an unbroken gaze turned inward, meant to quiet all worldly thoughts. The darkness remains. No candles are wasted. You sit, still cloaked in the night, listening to the wind scrape the corners of the stone walls. You are not singing for God, so much as singing with the hope of dissolving yourself into his rhythm. Only the soft scrape of sandals, or the occasional cough, breaks the hush. The first of these services, matins, is what now pulls you from your bedding and sends you bleary-eyed toward the chapel. You slept in a simple wool tunic. No mattress beneath you, just straw, or perhaps a coarse sack stuffed with whatever could be found. A single blanket may have been permitted, though not in every monastery. Warmth is not a priority. In fact, comfort is often considered a distraction from godliness. You feel the cold instantly. Not the soft chill of autumn, but the sharp, invasive kind that creeps into your bones and stays there. You don't see anything, your eyes are still heavy. The only light comes from a flickering torch far down the hallway. But the sound pulls you from sleep with a kind of gravity, a command more than a request. You rise. You don't rise like someone late for school or work might, grumbling or yawning or stretching. There's no comfort here. It is probably around 2 or 3 a.m. You don't know for sure, since no monk owns a clock, and time is measured by the bells. The floor is freezing. If you are barefoot, as many monks were in harsher orders, you feel the stone pierce your soles. If you're permitted simple sandals, they do little to help. You dress quickly in your habit, a long coarse robe usually made of wool. It is scratchy and heavy, and while it offers some warmth, it is never meant to be luxurious. Luxury is a word you've long learned to view with suspicion. You don't speak. In many monasteries, especially those following the rule of Saint Benedict or stricter interpretations. Silence is the norm. Matins begins. You file into the choir stalls. There are psalms to chant, dozens, depending on the liturgical calendar. Some monks struggle to stay awake. After matins, there's often a pause, maybe an hour or more, before the next prayer service lauds. Lauds begins while the sky is still ink dark. It will not be light for a while, and that suits the mood. By the time the prayers end, dawn may be breaking. A faint grayness presses at the stained glass windows. Waking before the sun is not just a matter of schedule. Sometimes in the quiet stillness of those pre-dawn hours, there is a flicker of something else. Not joy exactly, but peace. A sense of rhythm. From the moment you stepped through the cloister gate and gave yourself to the monastery, you gave up everything. Not just your home, your family, your name. Though all of those things were already surrendered. You also gave up the very idea of owning anything. Not a book, not a spoon, not even the clothes on your back. When you first arrived as a novice, you were allowed to keep some basic garments. Maybe a shirt, a pair of shoes, a belt, just until the formal vows were taken. But once that sacred moment came, everything you'd worn or carried was stripped away, symbolically and literally. If you were assigned to copy manuscripts, you did not have a writing desk, you used one. In chapter 33, Benedict writes, "You did not own a psalter, you were entrusted with one. Let no one presume to give or receive anything without the abbot's permission, or to keep anything as their own. Nothing at all, not a book, writing tablets, or a pen. And when the task changed, or you moved on, it was returned without hesitation. You were meant to see yourself as a temporary steward of objects, not a master over them." This mindset trained humility, dependence, and detachment. If you lingered too long over a certain stylus or wax tablet, someone might gently remind you that the rule warns against private ownership, and possession fed pride. The less you had, the closer you could come to humility. And humility was the seed of grace. The monastery itself was filled with furniture, liturgical items, tools, vessels, books, and sometimes even relics of great value. If meat was ever offered, which was rare and only under special circumstances, it was divided evenly without favoritism. You didn't have to worry about wealth, about theft, about status symbols, or keeping up with others. The monastery provided, but only what was needed, not what was wanted. That difference mattered. Some orders were relatively lenient, allowing a small personal psalter, or an icon gifted by a spiritual mentor. These were accepted, but always in the name of the community, not any one monk. If you owned nothing, not even a name in some cases, how did you know who you were? Your prayers, your labor, your presence in the rhythm of the divine office. These defined you more than any object could. You are not Brother Thomas, who owns a beautiful cloak. You were simply Brother Thomas, the one who rises at matins, the one who works in the scriptorium, the one who chants the psalms with quiet intensity. Your being was formed by your discipline and devotion, not by your possessions. If a donor asked to speak with a monk whose work had impressed them, a scribe, for example, or a talented healer, they might be gently redirected to the abbot. Others struggled quietly, but even the struggle was part of the path. Praise was shared, not personalized. The monastery spoke with one voice. Others, like the Cistercians or the Carthusians, were unyielding. Not even sentimental objects were allowed. If it could warm the heart, it could feed pride. And if it fed pride, it endangered the soul. No one was richer or poorer. Everyone wore the same robe. Everyone ate the same food. Everyone walked barefoot or wore the same rough sandals. The poorest peasant who became a monk instantly gained the dignity of spiritual equality. But these were provided not as privileges, but as necessities. And when that monk recovered or passed away, the items were returned to the common store. Nothing stayed with you. Nothing followed you to the grave. No jewelry, no keepsakes, no stone engraved with your name. Just earth and silence. Because in death, as in life, you owned nothing. And yet, in giving up all, you had gained something eternal. And the nobleman who took vows left his riches behind, entering into that same shared poverty. You did not request specific foods. You ate what was given. If you disliked it, that was considered an opportunity to build discipline. But none of it was yours. But no decorations, no curtain, no pillow embroidered with your name. If a blanket was too thin or your tunic was worn through, you might ask for a replacement, but not one you chose. The idea of having preferences or favorites was discouraged. If you found a particular spoon more comfortable in your hand and made an effort to keep it, that, too, was noticed. Even the items you used every single day, a cup from which you drank, a rosary you prayed with, a blanket that kept you from freezing, were not truly yours. If asked, you would be expected to hand them over without resentment. Ownership, after all, was tied to pride, to vanity, to the earthly world you had left behind. If you did, even for a second, it revealed spiritual attachment. The proper response was to give it up willingly, even gladly. Clinging was a danger. Ownership, a delusion. If you owned a beautiful cup, you might take pleasure in it. A brother who had secretly sewn an extra pocket into his robe to carry a pebble from home. A simple stone, but one that tethered him to the past. Another who was caught admiring his own illuminated manuscript too often, tracing the gold leaf with pride in his eyes. Both were quietly corrected, gently but firmly, sometimes even reassigned to more menial labor until the pride had passed. If you owned a knife, you might think yourself slightly more important than the man who didn't. Even something as small as a decorated comb or a pouch sewn with care might invite spiritual danger. Possessions were attachments, and attachments were chains. Your hair was cut, your name was changed or dropped, and your belongings were handed over. From that moment on, nothing was yours, not one object. This wasn't a punishment. In the eyes of the monastery, it was liberation. Monks lived communally, and so everything was shared. Clothing was issued from the vestry, kept in a central store, and laundered in rotation. If a robe grew thin or was beyond repair, it would be replaced by another from the common supply, not necessarily new, and certainly not chosen for comfort or style. If you took special interest in the quality of your robe, you were suspected of vanity. The ideal monk should be indifferent to such things. Even tools and books, highly valued in the monastery, belong to the order, not the individual. That rule, the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed by many Western monastic communities, was particularly clear on this point. Let the vice of private ownership be utterly uprooted from the monastery. This wasn't just about sharing. It was about creating a life so free from self-interest that even the idea of possession began to fade. It also created a paradox. Because while you are not permitted to own anything, your life was still surrounded by material objects, and you were tested. Sometimes a senior monk might quietly request your knife or your writing stylus, just to see if you hesitated. There were stories passed among monks about those who had faltered in this area. Pride, after all, was seen as the root of all sin. This philosophy reached deep into daily life. Meals were served not on individual plates, but in common dishes passed down the table. Even your sleeping arrangements followed this logic. Beds were not personalized. You had a spot in the dormitory, perhaps a pallet of straw or a wooden board. It's easy to imagine how stark and restrictive this life must have felt. But within the monastery, it was regarded as a profound freedom. But poverty wasn't exactly the right word, not in the worldly sense. You didn't starve. You weren't exposed to the elements. There were debates, even among monks, about how strict this should be. Visitors sometimes found this puzzling. Nobles who came to donate land or request prayers might offer lavish gifts, chalices, tapestries, manuscripts. You might wonder, in such an environment, what happened to the idea of identity? The answer was both simple and mysterious. You became your role. Some monks found great peace in this. Occasionally, exceptions were made. If a monk became ill or infirm, he might be allowed a special cushion or a warmer blanket. And that, too, was part of the lesson. At your burial, simple, unmarked, and quiet, you would be laid to rest not in fine robes, but in the same plain cloth worn by all. You wake up before dawn, not with an alarm, but with a gentle tap on the shoulder from another monk. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. Words have no place here. You nod, rise from your straw-filled mattress, and begin to move silently through the dim cloister. You want to speak to greet the brother walking beside you, to ask a question during work, to sigh in frustration when your stomach growls mid-morning. But you cannot. The rule of silence isn't just about refraining from casual chatter. It's about eliminating idle words altogether. The idea was simple. Silence allowed you to listen not to others, but to God. And yet, in practice, it was anything but simple. In silence, you were forced to confront your inner self, stripped of the comforts and distractions of conversation. During meals, scripture is read aloud by a designated reader. But on the other, it creates a kind of unity that transcends language. Everyone is silent together. Everyone listens together. In the scriptorium, you sit side by side with other monks copying manuscripts. No one speaks, but you can feel the presence of each man through the soft scratch of quills, the rustle of parchment, the deep shared breath of concentration. They spoke of a still small voice that could only be heard when all others were quiet. And so you wait, you listen, not with your ears, but with your soul. The rest of you eat in silence, listening to the word as you chew your bread or spoon your pottage. Grief, for instance, becomes harder to bear when you can't express it. If unspoken prayers are just as strong, the monks believe they are. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guides your life, says that silence is a guard on the tongue, a protection against sin. It reflects who you are, whether you want to see it or not. But there are others when it feels like a friend. A presence, not an absence. A gift, not a punishment. It strips away pretense, vanity, impatience. It teaches you to think before acting, to weigh your words before offering them. In a world full of noise, your silence becomes its own kind of prayer, steady, quiet, and heard only by heaven. And when you do speak once a week, perhaps during confession or instruction, your voice sounds foreign to your own ears. You speak slowly, deliberately. Every word matters now, but it does not say it is easy. A brother dies, and the monastery mourns in silence. No shared stories, no spoken prayers beyond the formal liturgy. You go about your duties with a heavier step, unable to say what you feel. The silence demands dignity, but sometimes what you crave is release. You become more observant, more attuned to the rhythm of the day, the tolling of bells, the flicker of candlelight, the changes in the wind. You begin to hear the world in ways you never did before. Silence teaches you how to listen deeply. It teaches you patience, humility, self-control. The communal act of dining, stripped of speech, becomes something else entirely reflective, sacred, strange. A raised eyebrow, a slight smile, a nod, these become your conversations. The community builds a quiet form of intimacy, one that doesn't rely on words. You learn to comfort without speaking, to forgive with a glance, to understand through presence alone. It was a purification, a fire that burned away the ego. But it could also feel like isolation. You could live alongside dozens of brothers and still feel completely alone. Days when your thoughts spiral, when regret creeps in, when the absence of speech makes the noise in your mind unbearable. On a crisp winter morning, when snow lies untouched on the cloister lawn and the world is still, the silence feels holy, not empty, but full, full of mystery, of peace, of God. It is then that you understand why monks chose this path, not because it was easy, but because it changed them. Without external voices, you are left with only your own, and sometimes that voice can be cruel. You remember home. You remember family. You remember a life where laughter was allowed, where emotions didn't have to be swallowed down, but you took a vow. You surrendered your voice to something greater. The only sound is the soft shuffle of sandals against cold stone. In others, it was more relaxed, allowing limited speech in the fields or during certain hours. But even then, restraint was expected. Jokes were rare. Gossip was forbidden. You were meant to speak with purpose, or not at all. Silence is not just a rule here, it is a way of being. The rule of silence was one of the most defining and difficult aspects of monastic life. For many, it began the moment they crossed the threshold of the monastery and ended only in death. Unlike the modern concept of silence, which may mean simply being quiet, the silence observed in medieval monasteries was a spiritual discipline. There was the chapter house, where daily readings and discussions were held. There was the confessional. There was the chanting of the divine office. Outside of that, your voice was a rare visitor. Even necessary communication was conducted through an established system of hand signals, each gesture conveying a specific message: water, food, books, tools. You learned to express without vocalizing, to ask without disturbing. It made you more deliberate in every movement, more thoughtful in every choice. But it also made you lonely. A constant inner and outer practice that shaped how you thought, how you behaved, and who you became. At first, it feels unnatural. In most Benedictine monasteries, speech was limited to specific times and places. You begin to notice the way silence changes things. It turns a shared glance into a conversation. It makes every sound a bird's cry, a footstep, a sneeze seem louder, heavier, more meaningful. Without the background noise of everyday life, your mind becomes sharper. At least, that's the theory. In reality, the silence can sometimes be suffocating. There are moments you want to scream, just to hear your own voice, to break the stillness. But you don't, because this silence is sacred. It is the very foundation of your discipline. The monks believed that constant talking distracted the soul. Idle words were dangerous, even sinful. They encouraged pride, conflict, desire. You might spend an entire week without saying a word. There's a paradox to this silence. On one hand, it disconnects you from the world and even from your fellow monks. Still, it's not always peaceful. There are days when silence feels more like punishment than prayer. In some orders, the rule was absolute. Silence could also be a source of spiritual power. The Desert Fathers, early Christian hermits who inspired monastic life, believed silence brought you closer to God. Over time, the silence shapes you. Your thoughts slow down. It also teaches you to read faces. And yet, there is something deeply human that is lost. You wonder, in those darker moments, if God hears what you don't say. There is beauty in it, too. By the end of your first year, silence no longer feels like a cage. It feels like a mirror. There are days when the silence still aches. And so you live it, day after day, hour after hour. You never needed a clock to know what time it was in the monastery. The bells told you everything. They rang in the deep hours of the night, before your body had finished its rest. These weren't casual prayers or occasional devotions. They were fixed, sacred, and strictly observed. You arrived already chanting in your head the psalms that were about to pour from your lips. The air was cold, breath clouded as it left your nose, and the chants rose like mist into the vaulted ceiling. Another hour, another set of psalms, hymns, and canticles, this time meant to sanctify the coming of the day. It was not about how you felt. It was about obedience. You were always moving, standing, bowing, genuflecting. The repetition wore on your body. By now, the melodies had blurred. You couldn't always tell one song from the next, but that was part of the purpose. The prayers weren't meant to be understood like a book. They were meant to be lived like breath. You had to give yourself over to them completely. Let them carry you. You learned to kneel without complaint, even when the stone floor made your knees burn. It came after dinner, after the day's work was done, after the silence had once again wrapped itself around the monastery like a cloak. It was quiet, warm, ground into you slowly over years of the same movements, the same syllables, the same stone beneath your knees. They admired the discipline, the tranquility, the pious devotion, but they didn't see the exhaustion, the sore joints, the mental toll of reciting the same prayers day after day until you weren't sure if you were praying or simply mouthing sounds into the void. It was a path not of sudden enlightenment, but of slow surrender, a surrender that broke and remade you. That was the rhythm. It was all part of the same devotion, the denial of pleasure, the focus on heaven, the sharpening of the soul through ritual. That was your life. You weren't a man anymore with dreams or desires. You were part of a collective breath, a living instrument of praise. You prayed. You missed the outside world, yes, but it also frightened you now. It seemed chaotic, loud, hungry. These prayers were short, meant to guard the soul before sleep. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. You said it with your head bowed. Your back ached. Your lips moved through the Latin, almost on their own. You learned to chant through dryness in your throat, through hunger in your belly, through exhaustion in your bones. You were expected to rise if you woke in the night and pray silently in your bed. You didn't choose which prayers to say. They were assigned by the rule, by tradition, by centuries of discipline. Some monks knew the entire Psalter by heart, 150 psalms, every word memorized through sheer repetition. Even if you didn't, the familiarity bred a strange comfort. These weren't your words, but they had become your voice. The rhythm of devotion never stopped pulsing through your life. About letting your voice join the invisible chorus of monks across the world who were also praying, also chanting, also half awake. You stood, then sat, then stood again. Your knees ached. The wood beneath you was hard, polished only by generations of bodies kneeling in the same place. But the repetition created a rhythm, a flow, a kind of peace. Matins began in the dead of night, around 2 or 3 a.m. The bell would sound through the cloister, echoing off the stone, summoning you from a narrow bed where warmth never quite took hold. A sense that maybe, just maybe, all this effort meant something more than discipline. Maybe it touched the divine. Maybe you had left behind the world to reach something purer. Or maybe you were just tired. It was hard to tell. Each required you to stop whatever you were doing. Tending the gardens, copying manuscripts, cooking in silence, and return to the church. Return to the Psalms. Return to God. You would throw your feet onto the cold floor, slip into your coarse habit, and shuffle silently through the dark halls to the church. They rang in the stillness of morning as the sky turned from black to gray. They rang in the middle of your work, in the middle of your meals, in the middle of your thoughts. Each chime was a command. Rise, come, pray. The structure of your day, of every monk's day, was carved around the liturgy of the hours. There was no room for delay, no grogginess, no comfort. Matins could last hours. You would chant in Latin, often without fully understanding the words, though you knew their weight. For matins, there was little rest. Sometimes you were allowed to return to your cell for a short sleep, but often you went straight into lauds at sunrise. Prime followed shortly after prayers to bless your labors. Then terce, sext, and none, scattered throughout the working hours. It was not just the prayers themselves, but the physical toll they took. Vespers came with the evening light. You watched it stream through the high windows, casting long shadows over the altar. Compline was the last prayer, the final release. And then, finally, rest, but not escape. Because prayer never left you, even in sleep. Each of the hours was marked by the divine office, a sequence of psalms, antiphons, readings, hymns, and blessings. And sometimes, in the silence between verses, you felt something. A flicker. A lightness. This wasn't the kind of religion with loud sermons and fiery passion. Visitors sometimes came and marveled at your stillness. You wondered often if God heard you, if these chants reached beyond the stone walls. But you kept going, because that was the rule. Even meals were part of the liturgy. You ate in silence as another monk read aloud from Scripture. You chewed with discipline. You tasted little. Over time, your identity dissolved into the rhythm. Here, everything was ordered, and prayer gave it shape. 1,000 voices chanted across the centuries, and yours had joined them. Even when your knees trembled, even when your voice cracked, even when you questioned it all. And then you prayed again. You shuffle into the refectory, feet wrapped in rough wool, the echo of footsteps bouncing softly off the cold stone walls. The long wooden tables stretch ahead in perfect rows, set with simple bowls, cups, and a hunk of dark, crusty bread at each place. No one speaks, no one dares. In this solemn space, silence is as essential as the food you're about to receive, perhaps more so. Conversation, indulgence, distraction, those belong to the outside world. Here even nourishment is spiritual. The room itself is austere, undecorated except for a crucifix on one end wall and a small lectern on the other. You do not start eating until the reading begins. You do not linger after you are finished. When the last spoon is set down, all monks rise in unison and bow their heads in a silent prayer of thanks. You forget what it felt like to eat with joy or spontaneity. Meals become part of the rhythm of your sacrifice. Even on feast days, when a little extra food might be allowed, celebration is quiet, measured, no clinking of mugs or laughter at the table. Just an extra ladle of soup and a murmured psalm of gratitude. Then you file out, hands tucked in sleeves, returning to labor or study as though nothing happened. Because to the outside world, it wouldn't seem like anything did. It's considered a high responsibility. You must enunciate clearly, read slowly, and choose passages that nourish the spirit as surely as the food nourishes the body. The climate affects what can be grown and harvested, of course. In colder regions, turnips and onions may appear more often. In warmer places, perhaps olives or herbs. But nowhere is the food indulgent. No matter the location, the refectory remains a place of restraint. Even here, in the most basic daily ritual, your soul is being shaped quietly and deliberately. In the monastery, silence wraps around the refectory like a second skin. They're often surprised by the severity of the meal, the solemnity, the discipline. To them, it may feel cold, even inhumane. But to you, it becomes something else. It's not a punishment. It's a practice, a ritual, a way of detaching from the world so you can attach more deeply to the divine. At first, it's oppressive. You long to whisper a comment to your brother beside you. The servers serve everyone else before they themselves take a seat. Equality, humility, obedience. Those are the values reinforced with every mealtime. You want to laugh, to react, to share. But you don't. You learn to keep your thoughts to yourself, to turn inward. When all the distractions of flavor, conversation, and indulgence are stripped away, what remains is the act itself basic, human, sacred, until the rhythm becomes a kind of music, until the meal becomes a meditation, until the hunger becomes holy. You eat because you must. You live because God wills it. And you pray because that is the reason you are here. Eventually, the silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels like prayer, like discipline, like peace. A single monk stands ready with a large book, perhaps the Rule of Saint Benedict or a volume of scripture. On fasting days, especially during Lent, you may receive only one meal or none at all until sundown. You feel weak, irritable, lightheaded, but you bear it because this too is part of the life you chose. That crust of bread, though dry and flavorless, carries the weight of centuries of tradition. But if caught, the consequences are severe. You might be publicly reprimanded, lose privileges, or be forced to fast even further, not for punishment's sake, but to purge you of pride, to teach humility, to remind you that food is not for pleasure, it is for function, for fuel, for faith. Every bite is a reminder that you are not here for comfort. You are here to deny the body so that the soul might flourish. Lentils boiled in water, barley porridge that tastes faintly of the smoke from the hearth. The idea is not to delight in eating, but to endure it, to thank God for sustenance, no matter how meager. Hunger, after all, is a tool for humility. You eat what you are given, when you are given it, with the hands you use for prayer and labor. Stale bread may be softened by a dip into weak broth. If it's a feast day, perhaps you'll find a few cooked vegetables or a small amount of cheese. Fish might appear on Fridays or during Lent, but meat is strictly forbidden unless a monk is gravely ill. Even then, it would be eaten in a separate room, so as not to tempt the others. His voice will soon echo gently through the space, reading aloud while the rest of you eat. That voice becomes the only sound, save the occasional scrape of a wooden spoon or the clink of a cup being carefully set down. The food, if one could call it that with any enthusiasm, is plain to the point of being penitential. You are not allowed to ask for more food, nor to comment on its quality. The meals are served by monks appointed as the week's kitchen servers. These roles rotate, and taking your turn in the kitchen is part of the shared responsibility of monastic life. There is no special status in cooking or serving. Even the abbot eats the same food as the novices. When it is your week, you rise even earlier than usual to prepare the meager fare, wash the bowls and cups, and scrub the wooden tables until your back aches. Everything is done in order. You wait for the abbot's signal before beginning. Yet for you, that bowl of porridge might be the only warm moment in a cold day. Over time, your palate dulls. You no longer yearn for spice or sweetness. But it's not just the food that changes you, it's the silence. In the outside world, meals are a time for talk, for storytelling, for connection. Still, it is not without difficulty. Some days your stomach growls so loudly, it echoes louder than the reader's voice. It's not uncommon for novices to struggle. The temptation to sneak an extra bite from the kitchen, to stash a crust of bread under your robes for later, it lingers. In some monasteries, monks take turns reading during meals. Monasteries differ slightly across regions. A Benedictine abbey in France might serve slightly heartier fare than a Cistercian house in England. And if you think that being older or of higher rank earns you better food, you'd be wrong. The abbot eats last. Outside visitors, rare as they may be, are sometimes granted a place in the refectory. In truth, many monks come to treasure the simplicity of meals. So you sit again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, in the same spot, with the same bowl, in the same silence. The cold arrives without warning, creeping in through the stone walls like an uninvited spirit. It seeps into your robes at night, and settles in your bones by morning. There are no fires in the dormitory to greet you when you rise, no warm water to splash across your face, no heated stone floors beneath your feet. The monastery is a place of discipline, of denial, and that means warmth is not something you are meant to expect. A monk must be content with what he is given. If the climate is harsh, it is part of God's will. Heated water is nearly unheard of, especially in the colder months. If you are allowed to wash, it is with cold water from a basin or stream, and only for as long as necessary. There is no lingering, no steam, no luxury. Cleanliness is expected, yes, but comfort is not. If the wind cuts through the cracks in the dormitory walls, then so be it. They do not complain. They do not seek relief. They walk barefoot through snow. They sleep on hard boards without blankets. But more often, it is a tepid broth or a bowl of cold grains. The refectory is no warmer than any other room. You sit in silence, trying to eat before the food goes cold entirely, listening to the steady drone of scripture being read aloud. The bells sound softer under gray skies. The world slows down. You walk the corridors alone, breath misting before you, and you feel something unexpected. Peace. It humbles you. It reminds you of your mortality. It forces you to rely not on fire or blankets or pleasure, but on resilience, discipline, and grace. You see how the older monks walk through the cold without flinching, how they kneel on frozen floors without complaint, how they sleep in drafty rooms with nothing but thin robes. And you realize, this is strength. This is what you are here to become. You wash with icy water. You kneel on frozen stones. You eat your cold porridge, and you bow your head in silence. And you give thanks not for the cold itself, but for what the cold has taught you, how it has shaped you, how it has made you still. Not comfort, not warmth, but peace. The kind that comes from being emptied out, stripped down, reduced to your most essential self. You are no longer distracted by desire. You are no longer ruled by comfort. You are simply here, but the joy of simplicity, of endurance, of faith made stronger by adversity. Even here, you do not speak of your discomfort. It is assumed, expected, accepted. They fast and kneel and labor outdoors with hands cracked from frost. At night, your feet throb from the icy flagstones. And in that hardness, strangely, you begin to find joy. You wake up with a cough, your breath wheezing in the dark. When your body is aching and your fingers are numb, your prayers become sharper, more urgent, more honest. You are no longer asking for abstract blessings. You are simply asking to endure, to remain faithful, to be shaped by the experience. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of this frozen world. But there is no complaint. No hot drink to ease your throat. No fire to thaw your limbs. Instead, you go to lauds, as always, chanting the psalms through chattering teeth. Your suffering is not unique. Every monk around you feels it too. But no one speaks of it. These acts are not for show. They are part of a deep, inward discipline. A way to strip away pride, to quiet the ego, to offer one's suffering as a daily prayer. You are not here to indulge the body. You are here to shape the soul. And so you endure. You learn to move more slowly, to keep your hands folded against your chest, to warm them with your breath. You learn where the walls block the wind best during outdoor labor. But to ask for such relief is seen as a weakness, a failure of devotion. Better to bear the pain quietly. Offering it to God is a sacrifice. After all, Christ suffered in the cold. The saints walked through winter with bleeding feet. Your discomfort is nothing in comparison. You learn which stones hold the faintest trace of sunlight in the afternoon. These tiny things become comforts, though you are not supposed to think of them as such. Your woolen robe, coarse and heavy, does little against the chill. They draw people together, create comfort, spark conversation, and in a world that values silence, solitude, and suffering, those things are distractions. Fires are for the kitchen and the smithy, not for warming the body. To feel the cold is to remember that life is fragile, fleeting, and full of trials. And that is the point. It itches your skin and smells faintly of damp straw and age, but you cling to it because it is all you have. There is no second layer, no soft linen, no fur lining. Just this robe, tied at the waist with a belt of rope, and your bare legs beneath it. In the depths of winter, it is not uncommon to sleep fully dressed, curled tightly beneath your thin blanket, praying for the coming sun. And yet, the sun rarely helps. The stone walls of the monastery retain the cold, trapping it in long corridors and dimly lit cloisters. The great church where you gather for prayer is beautiful. Yes, but it is also vast and freezing. Breath becomes visible in the morning hours, curling like incense through the air. You sit through matins before dawn, shivering on the stone benches, your hands tucked deep in your sleeves, lips silently moving in chant. The words you recite are ancient, but the cold is more immediate. It tightens your throat and stiffens your fingers, but you continue. In the rule of Saint Benedict, there is little written about comfort. There are no fires in your chamber, no glowing hearths to gather around after prayer. Fires, after all, can be temptations. Bathing is rare. Perhaps once a month, perhaps less, depending on the monastery's rules and resources. Some monks, particularly in stricter orders like the Cistercians, embrace the cold as a form of penance. You find yourself adapting, slowly. The cold no longer feels like a shock, but like a constant companion. Your body aches. The joints stiffen, the skin cracks. In rare cases, monks may be excused from certain duties if the cold proves too much for their health. Meals do little to help. A warm stew, when it comes, is a blessing. And yet, despite all this, there is something strangely beautiful about the stillness of a monastery in winter. The snow falls in silence, blanketing the cloisters and gardens in white. There is a spiritual clarity that comes with cold. Over time, you come to see the cold not as your enemy, but as your teacher. The monastery, in winter, is a crucible. It burns away what is soft and selfish. It hardens the spirit, not the joy of warmth or indulgence. So you wake each morning to cold breath and stiff limbs. For in a world stripped of comfort, you have found clarity. And in that clarity, you have found something closer to peace. You rise from prayer with aching knees, your fingers still stiff from the cold chapel floor. There is no applause, no word of thanks, only the quiet shuffle of feet as brothers file out and begin the next part of the day. Labor, not a task to be finished, not something to complain about, but something sacred. Every turn of the spade is an act of praise, and every blister, every sore muscle is a reminder. You do not live for yourself. Now you are called to the bakery, where ovens glow like small suns, and the air is thick with flour and sweat. The monks here work quietly, efficiently, their faces pale from the heat. And this, too, is not what outsiders imagine. It is not romantic, not peaceful. It is backbreaking. You sit on hard benches, with poor posture and worse lighting. You grind pigments from insects and minerals. You sharpen your quills with careful precision. In the garden, a robin might land on a frost-bitten branch near you, chirping once before flying off. In the scriptoria, a brother might pass you a warmer cloak, worn but kind. These are your rewards, not silver, not food, not recognition, but the occasional flicker of human warmth, passed quietly from soul to soul. You write slowly, reverently, knowing that a single mistake could ruin an entire manuscript. Even illness does not excuse you unless you are near death. If you can stand, you are expected to work. If you can't write, you dig. If you can't dig, you clean. It is a different kind of work, spiritual maintenance. You hear a brother admit to nodding off during vigils, another to hoarding crusts of bread. Each is met with discipline, sometimes severe, but always with the promise of restoration. Because even in correction, there is sacred labor. And if you can't clean, you pray. Always, there is something to do. You kneel again. You chant again. You hold the hours of toil and offer them back to God like a crude folded paper in a child's hands. You copy the word of God, and you dare not add or subtract a single letter. There is no praise for beauty, only scrutiny for accuracy. No crowds will gather to see the walls you helped build or the manuscripts you transcribed. The peas you planted will be eaten by someone else. The floors you scrubbed will be walked over by generations who never think of you. An idle monk, the rule of St. Benedict warns, is a devil's workshop. You pray as you work not out loud, but with your heart. And sometimes it feels like your prayers rise with the steam of boiling laundry or with the fine dust from parchment scraping. Other times it feels like they go nowhere. If your hands aren't occupied, your mind will wander. And where your mind wanders, your soul might follow. They bake not for joy, but for sustenance for the brothers, for the poor at the gates, for travelers who knock with empty hands. Just as sacred as the whispered Latin of the Psalms, or the smoke of incense curling above the altar, or to the wine cellar where barrels are tapped and measured, but no drop ever crosses your lips except in sacrament. Maybe even to the stables, brushing down the monastery's mules, whispering prayers to no one as steam rises from their flanks. There is no glamour here, only the discipline of hands that move in silence. You walk in silence, your sandals slick with dew, heading toward the scriptoria or the vegetable plots. You don't choose your duty, the prior does. And when he speaks, you obey. It could be a week spent hunched over parchment, eyes burning from candlelight, copying a Bible you'll never own. Or it could be days in the cloister garden, hands deep in the hard winter soil, coaxing limp cabbage from the earth, turning manure with numb fingers. Neither is considered more important than the other, because here, in this cloister, every action is service to God. Every stroke of the quill is a hymn. The bell tolls not to end the day's labor, but to reorient it. Later, you might be assigned to the infirmary, changing the linens of the sick, spooning broth into trembling mouths. If you are literate, and not all monks are, you may spend your hours in the scriptoria. You do not sign your name, because nothing here is about you. Sometimes, though, there are moments, small ones. The labor itself is relentless. There are no weekends, no breaks in the season, and not doing it, that is sin. Laziness is one of the greatest spiritual threats, not just because it wastes time, but because it invites temptation. So you keep your head down. You keep your thoughts simple. Dig, wash, bind, copy, lift, sweep. But still you pray. Still you work. Not all labor is physical. Some days you sit in chapter house meetings where wrongdoings are confessed in front of the whole community. And at the end of the day, when your body throbs with exhaustion, when your hands are cracked from soap or ink or snowmelt, you return to the chapel. And maybe, just maybe, that's what holiness looks like. Not perfection, not glory, but obedience, repetition, faithfulness in the smallest motions. No one outside the cloister will ever know your name, but your labor remains. In the smooth stones of the cloister walk, in the faint ink of ancient gospel margins, in the garden soil that still smells like effort and prayer, and in that quiet belief that your work mattered not because of what it was, but because of why it was done. In silence, in sacrifice, in worship. You are not immune to temptation. You were told, before you came here, that the cloister was a place of purity, a high wall against the evils of the world. But no wall, no matter how thick, can fully shut out the quiet voice that speaks within. You do not leave your humanity at the gates. You carry it into the monastery like a bundle of thorns, and you are expected to tame it. You do not speak to him. You dare not. But still, your thoughts drift in the silence of your cell, unwelcome but persistent. Temptation comes quietly. It does not roar. It flickers. A second blanket in winter, a stolen nap during labor, a single word spoken in the refectory when you know you should be silent. And even the whisper of disobedience, even the shadow of self-will, is seen as a rot that must be cut away. Perhaps it is the way your eyes linger just a second too long on the new novice. Tall, bright-eyed, hair recently shorn. But they matter here. They matter immensely. Or perhaps it comes in the form of hunger, not for food, though that is constant, but for softness, for comfort. These are small things, because sin is not only judged by its consequence, but by its very existence. So when you fall, even a little, there are consequences. There is no privacy in sin, no quiet forgiveness. In the monastic world, sin is brought into the light like mildew scraped from stone. You kneel before your brothers and confess it, not because you are brave, but because the rule demands it. The air in the chapter house is thick with unspoken shame as the prior listens. They step over your body on the way to matins. Some avoid your gaze. Others murmur prayers. You remain there, still as stone, not by a stranger, but by the one you call your brother. His face is pale. His hand trembles. But the strap comes down all the same. One lash for the flesh, one for the soul, one for the community. You do not cry out. You have trained yourself not to. His face is impassive, but you know he weighs your words carefully. You say, I fell asleep during lauds. Some are forbidden to speak or sing in choir for a week, silenced, not out of reverence, but as a sign of their unworthiness. When you are denied the Eucharist, that small white host, the only warmth in a cold life, and must sit silently as others receive it, the loss of that shared grace is a wound deeper than any cane could inflict. Food pushed through a hatch, no contact, no voice, only your own thoughts echoing against the stone walls. Some monks break during these confinements. Others grow harder, but no one remains the same. You may sing again, eat beside them, sleep in peace, or I took an extra portion of turnips, or I harbored impure thoughts. Sometimes it is more serious. I spoke during the great silence. You fill your time with labor, your thoughts with scripture. You avoid eye contact. You keep your posture rigid. You fast even when it is not required, not because you want to suffer, but because you fear what you might become if you do not. You punish your own thoughts before the prior ever has to. And you are iron being heated, shaped, struck again and again until the impurities are driven out. You bow low. You ask for forgiveness. The prior, if he believes your repentance is sincere, will speak the ancient words. Then one by one, your brothers step forward. They place their hands on your shoulder, silently welcoming you back, when silence no longer sharpens, but dulls. No one smiles, no one weeps, but in that gesture is everything. You feel their eyes on you, not out of cruelty, but pity. Pity is worse. I laughed. I disobeyed the prior's order. And then come the punishments. They are not always violent, but they are always humiliating. You may be ordered to eat your meals standing in the center of the refectory, while the rest of the brothers sit and stare straight ahead. Or you may be told to prostrate yourself at the threshold of the chapel for days, face pressed to the cold floor, begging the community to let you back in. For serious transgressions, you might be given a whipping. Some are denied bread for a day. Others are made to fast beyond the usual rule. In the most grievous cases, if you disobey persistently, or worse, commit the unspeakable sins of the flesh, you may be confined to your cell for weeks. Yet the greatest punishment is perhaps not the beatings or the fasting. It is exclusion. When the community turns its face from you, when the chant begins and your voice is not invited to join. Still, even punishment has a purpose here. It is not meant to destroy. It is meant to purify. The monastery is not a prison. It is a forge. There is mercy too, but it is hard won. After penance, you kneel once more in the chapter house. You are restored. but you will never forget, and neither will they. And so you watch yourself. You fight temptation in its earliest forms, the glance, the laziness, the daydream. Every monk has his private struggle. For one, it is pride. For another, envy. For yet another, despair. But the most dangerous sin of all is the one no one sees, acedia, the soul's weariness, the dry emptiness that seeps in after months or years of obedience, when prayer feels like an echo, when work brings no joy. You know that acedia leads to everything else. It makes you careless, then restless, then angry. And anger leads to contempt, contempt to rebellion. So you guard yourself. You confess often, and still, you stumble, because you are not yet holy, because you are still human. And the cloister, for all its rules and stone and scripture, cannot make you perfect. It can only give you a place to struggle. So when the bell tolls again, and you rise from your knees, sore and sorely tempted, you do what all the monks before you have done. You bow your head. You return to your labor, and you begin again. Your cell is small. It is not a room in the way the outside world thinks of rooms. It is not a place for rest or comfort. It is not decorated, nor inviting. There is no fire, no paintings, no desk, just 4 stone walls, a door, a narrow bed of wood, and a wooden prie-dieu where you kneel to pray. This is not a place you go to escape. This is a place where you are laid bare. There is a single window. It is small and high and unglazed. Wind whistles through it in winter, and even in spring you can see your breath. Your cell is the size of a grave, and in many ways it is a rehearsal for it. They echo every movement you make. When you shift on the straw mattress, the rustle seems to rebound around the room, as if it disapproves of your fidgeting. Only a folded cloth. The way your legs cramp from kneeling too long. You learn what it means to endure. Not once, not heroically, but quietly, night after night, in a room that neither pities you nor rewards you. No blanket thick enough to comfort. No softness for the weary. This is deliberate. And sometimes, though you do not want to, you remember your old life. A mother's voice, a dog barking at dusk, the scent of apples in autumn. You enter the room at the end of a long corridor, your sandals brushing against cold flagstones that never warm, even in summer. The walls are bare, but not silent. They speak in groans, in settling stones, in the flutter of your candle. You are left with your thoughts, your weaknesses, your regrets. There is no crowd to vanish into, no task to lose yourself in. Only yourself, and the God you are learning, slowly, to seek with sincerity. But here, where nothing interrupts you, your thoughts ring clear and unfiltered. They rise like steam in winter. Some surprise you, others shame you. There is no pillow. You lie on your narrow cot and wonder if this is madness, if anyone could truly find peace in this place. You think of leaving. You think of opening the door, walking out into the world, finding a fire, a soft bed, a voice that calls your name. No witness to your virtue. If you resist temptation, no one sees it. If you weep with guilt, no one hears. You learn to repent not out of fear, but out of sorrow. You begin to speak to God not in grand language, but in the simple, broken speech of someone who has nothing left to prove. If you stay up the entire night in prayer, there is no reward, no praise, just cold stone and your own exhaustion. The rule of St. Benedict said, "The cell will teach you everything," and it does. At first, it teaches you discomfort, the aching in your joints, the shiver that creeps in as soon as the sun sets. It always does. But you remember it. You return to it when the silence becomes too heavy. You repeat to yourself the old words. Stay in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. That your prayers, though small and poor and halting, rise like incense. It strips you of your illusions. It breaks your pride your vanity, your desire to be known, that your suffering is seen, that your solitude is shared by the one who also withdrew into the wilderness. They ask to see them, expecting perhaps a small but cozy space, a nook, something like a hermit's retreat. You see their faces fall when they peer inside. They look at the bare bed, the walls, the lack of comfort. They whisper, "How can anyone live here?" Others stay and suffer in silence, never finding rest. But a few, a rare few, come to love their cells. They speak of them as teachers, as companions, as wounds and tombs both. But one day you realize you no longer hate the cold. You no longer resent the silence. You have grown into it. Then it teaches you stillness. You stop shifting. You stop sighing. You light your candle, kneel once more, and whisper your final prayers. You begin to move with care, with deliberation. You place your hands just so when you pray. You learn to sit in silence, even when silence feels like drowning. But the deepest lessons are those the cell whispers slowly, over weeks, months, and years. Or curled under the rough blanket, hands folded. The candle has burned low. The chill is deep, but the face is peaceful. You begin to notice your thoughts. Outside these walls, your mind was loud, distracted by conversation, by food, by chores, by the noise of the world. You remember things you thought you had forgotten. You relive conversations from years ago. You recall faces, some kind, some cruel. The candle flickers. The wind howls through the narrow window. And in that moment, you feel something. And then, after memory, comes the silence behind it. That's when the real struggle begins. If you will have made your peace with the stone, if you will have carved something holy out of silence, if you will have learned how to be alone, truly alone, and still beloved, because the cell does not distract you. It confronts you. In the cell, there is no applause for your effort. And yet, this is where transformation begins. You learn to pray not for recognition, but because you must. The saints said the cell was both a battlefield and a sanctuary. You understand now what they meant. At times, it feels like a tomb. The stone presses in. The silence crushes. But you don't, because something in you knows that this battle, this endless, grinding, silent battle, is holy. Not glorious, not clean, but holy. And on some nights, not many, but enough to keep you going, the cell becomes something else. You kneel at your wooden stand. It is not a voice, not a vision, but a sense, a quiet certainty that you are not alone, that God, too, knew what it meant to be alone in the dark. You do not cling to this feeling. It will pass. The cell teaches you patience. It teaches you how to wait, how to listen, how to endure without bitterness. And slowly, it builds something else. Not joy, not yet, but peace. A kind of peace that doesn't shout. It settles like dust. You hardly notice it at first. You and the stone together. When guests visit the monastery, they are often curious about the monks' cells. You say nothing. There is no way to explain. Because the cell is not something you describe. It is something you live. And in living it, you are changed. Not all monks make peace with their cells. Some never do. Some struggle for years and leave. When death comes, it is often in the cell. A monk is found on his knees, head resting against the wood of the prie-dieu. You think about this sometimes. You wonder if, when the time comes, you will be ready. For now, you return to your cell after Compline. The sky is dark. The stars are few. Outside, the world turns. Inside, the stone holds its breath. And you, monk of silence, lie down in the room that knows you better than anyone else ever could. The calendar tells you today is a feast day, but it doesn't feel like a celebration. The bell rings differently, not in its toll, but in the weight it carries. It is slower, deeper, and calls you not to a banquet, but to yet another kind of devotion. The abbey will bring out its gilded cross. Candles will line the altar in ranks like silent sentinels. The monks will chant with voices thinner from fasting, but still clear and true. You do not look about with shining eyes, brimming with anticipation. Today is set apart, made holy not through indulgence, but through the stripping away of what the world calls joy. There will be singing, yes. There will be longer services, incense, and processions. The stone of the chapel floor bites through your sandals. But you do not allow yourself to complain, not even silently. To an outsider, it might look beautiful, even festive. But inside these walls, joy is something very different than what the world imagines. You no longer keep track as the outside world does. The names and dates blend into a cycle that repeats with the rhythm of prayer and penance. Each feast has its own readings, its own chants, its own shadows. Each of you walks as if stepping into something sacred, careful not to disturb the thin veil that separates celebration from solemnity. You eat until you are reminded that God provides. That joy, when it comes, should be wrapped in humility. You do not smile today. You do not laugh. They said, "Woe to the monk who rejoices in earthly things." They taught that joy too easily slides into pride, that laughter leads to idleness, that comfort is the doorway through which sin tiptoes. You pray that God will teach you to fear comfort and to hunger for holiness instead, because holy days in the monastery are not meant to please the flesh, they are meant to discipline it. The rule reminds you, let the monk always show reverence on feast days, not levity. And you obey. You wake before dawn, your body aching from the long vigil the night before. The cold is sharper in the early morning. Their voices floated in on the wind, bright, careless, full of mischief. It kneels. It does not sparkle. It bows. It is found not in indulgence, but in surrender. You had been new then, barely tonsured, still unsure in your habits. Some wear bright colors. They look about, curious and distracted, glancing at the vaulted ceilings, at the flickering candles, at the solemn brothers in their warm robes. Not with indulgence, but with fasting. Not with noise, but with sacred silence. You chew slowly while the story unfolds. A martyr who gave up everything, who endured fire or blade or exile. The monks around you eat with lowered eyes, each man listening not for entertainment, but for edification. You paused at the sound, some long dormant part of you stirring. When you first entered the monastery, feast days disappointed you. You expected celebration, reprieve, a softening of the hard lines that ruled monastic life. They do not know that the joy you seek is deeper than laughter, quieter than song. Then it angered you. Then it broke you. He speaks not of worldly joy, but of joy in tribulation, joy in discipline, joy in sacrifice. You find joy when your hunger humbles you, when your tears come during prayer, and you do not wipe them away, when the light breaks through the high window of the chapel and reminds you that grace always enters from above. You process in silence with the others. The abbot leads the way. No one meets your gaze. No one nods, you do not shout. A monk must remain steady, rooted like a tree by still waters. Your heart is lifted, but your hands are still. You sing, but without flourish. You eat, but without greed. You pray, and the words are not jubilant, but reverent. The chant echoes faintly from the corridor. The feast is over. The joy has passed through you like a breath. You simply give thanks quietly and let it pass. The crucifixion, blood on wood, silence from the heavens. The resurrection, glorious, yes, but preceded by anguish and abandonment. Today is the feast of St. Michael, or perhaps it is Epiphany or Pentecost. But before you allow yourself to taste it, you pray. You give thanks not just for the food, but for the hunger that came before it. You sing the antiphons with the others, but your voice is low. Modest, you are not here to perform. in purity of heart, in clarity of purpose, or the scent of lily in the chapel, or the lingering sweetness of a single preserved fig awakens something tender in your chest. There is a meal later, more generous than most. A piece of fish, perhaps, a bit of honey on bread, maybe even cheese. In the monastery, even feasting is an act of restraint. You take your portion, small and reverent, and chew slowly. You do not eat until you're full. You have read the writings of the Desert Fathers. They warned against the laughter of fools. You believe them. Or, if you don't quite believe, you try to. Once, long ago, you remember hearing children laugh during a festival outside the monastery. But the older monk beside you did not pause. He closed his eyes, whispered, "That kind of joy does not last," and walked on. You never forgot it. Now, years later, you understand. Because real joy, the kind that matters, does not dance. You watch the guests arrive, those few permitted into the outer chapel for the feast day mass. They mistake stillness for sadness, silence for severity. They do not understand that your restraint is not bitterness, but devotion. To them, a feast is a time for merrymaking. For you, it is a time for trembling. Because to celebrate a holy day is to remember what it cost. The birth of Christ, a trembling mother on the cold earth. There is no joy in the Christian calendar that was not first paid for in suffering. So your feast day begins not with laughter, but with confession. Later, in the refectory, the reader stands and begins to read from a life of a saint. When the reading ends, the abbot gives a brief reflection. And you feel it, that fragile, aching warmth that is not pleasure, but something holier, the sense that you are where you are meant to be. You did not always feel this way. Instead, you found that feast days were simply another kind of rigor. You learned that the holier the day, the more you were expected to bow, to fast, to submit. At first, it confused you. And then, slowly, it began to rebuild you. Now you know, the joy of a monk is not found in full bellies or clapping hands. It is found in obedience. You find joy when the chant resonates in perfect harmony, not because it is beautiful, but because it was offered to God with all your breath. There are rare days when joy bubbles up unexpectedly, when the warmth of another brother's glance, but even then, you do not cling to it. You do not laugh, because the rule has warned you. To be easily moved to joy is to be easily moved to sorrow. So today, on this holy day, you remain quiet. And when the day ends, as all days do, you return to your cell not with a heart bursting, but with one bowed in gratitude. You kneel in the candlelight. And still, there is peace. Not the peace of pleasure, but of presence. Not the happiness of the world, but the joy that lives quietly in obedience. This, you realize, is the strange paradox of the monastic life. That your greatest joy is found in denial. That your feasts are most meaningful when they cost you something. That your soul grows not in laughter, but in longing. And that the deepest celebration begins when the last candle is snuffed out, and you are alone once more, not with revelry, but with God. The rhythm of the divine office, the fixed schedule of prayers and masses throughout the day. You would rise for matins in the deep night, and before each period of work, you would have spent time in prayer. Mistakes were inevitable. An errant stroke of the pen, a smudged letter, or a misread word could mean starting a page over. The pressure to produce error-free work could feel suffocating. Moreover, the isolation of the scriptorium, the long hours in cold stone rooms, and the lack of variety in daily tasks sometimes weighed heavily on the spirit. This ritual framed your labor not as mere work, but as a form of worship, an offering of your time, skill, and devotion to God. The solitary monk bent over a desk, quill in hand, was part of a chain stretching through time, a guardian of knowledge, a servant of faith, and a witness to the enduring power of the written word. The slow, repetitive copying of texts mirrored the repetitive nature of monastic prayer. a way to focus the mind and heart on divine truths. Yet, despite the sacred nature of your task, the work was not without its frustrations. The manuscripts you helped create and preserve played a crucial role in the survival of Western knowledge, especially during periods of turmoil and war. Monastic scriptoria became the bridges between the ancient world and the Renaissance, passing down texts that would shape philosophy, science, literature, and theology for centuries. Still, many monks found joy in their labor. The scriptorium was a place of quiet creativity, a realm where mind and spirit met in service of faith. The physical act of writing was also a form of meditation, a way to enter into the sacred text more deeply. As your hand moved across the page, you engaged not only your intellect, but your whole being in the work of God's kingdom. As you grew more skilled, you might have been entrusted with copying more complex or important texts, or assisting in the management of the library's collection. The respect earned through your craftsmanship and dedication was a form of status within the monastic community, even as all monks remained equal in the eyes of the rule. Your contributions, though often anonymous, were part of a larger legacy. In this way, your life in the library and scriptorium, while humble and demanding, was a quiet but vital force in the history of civilization. Living as a medieval monk meant embracing a life radically separated from the outside world. The world beyond the monastery walls was viewed not as a place of opportunity or joy, but as a source of temptation, sin, and spiritual danger. This belief was rooted in Christian theology and the writings of the Church Fathers, who often described the flesh, the world, and the devil as the three enemies of the soul. Town life represented everything the monk had renounced: worldly ambition, social climbing, festivals, markets, taverns. Celibacy was a fundamental vow, and monks were taught to guard their hearts and minds carefully. While the church incorporated chant and hymns as part of its worship, secular music was often seen as frivolous or even dangerous, capable of stirring inappropriate emotions or leading to immoral behavior. Monks were encouraged to see themselves as strangers and pilgrims on earth, temporarily residing in a hostile world from which they sought refuge. Temptations to break the rules, whether through secret contact with women, indulging in forbidden music, or even moments of laughter, were common struggles. While it was largely demonized, some monks also expressed a longing for connection and the human warmth that life outside could offer. Letters, diaries, and spiritual reflections often hint at the loneliness and inner conflicts experienced by those living under such strict vows. The tension between earthly desires and spiritual goals was a defining feature of monastic existence. The consequences for giving in to these temptations could be severe. Towns were places of disease, violence, and political instability. Monasteries, by contrast, offered relative security, peace, and a structured life. The fear of the outside reinforced the protective nature of the cloister and helped maintain discipline within the monastic community. Punishments ranged from penances and public humiliation to physical discipline, or even expulsion from the order. To live as a monk meant to turn away from it completely, embracing silence, solitude, and strict discipline. This worldview shaped every aspect of monastic life, from daily routines to personal thoughts and relationships. It demanded immense strength and commitment, but also imposed heavy burdens on those who chose this path. To fully understand medieval monasticism, one must grasp how deeply this fear of the outside world influenced the monk's life, shaping their identity and purpose in profound ways. The fear of spiritual failure was a constant presence, driving monks to vigilance and self-denial. This fostered a sense of humility and detachment, but also isolation and sometimes fear. Many monks struggled with loneliness and the sense of being cut off from human connections and pleasures. The community life of the monastery, while close-knit, could not fully replace the wider social world. Laughter, too, was something monks were cautioned against indulging in freely. The rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential monastic guides, instructed monks to avoid excessive laughter, seeing it as a potential opening for the devil to enter the heart. Monastic life demanded sobriety, seriousness, and constant mindfulness, with joy expressed in controlled, reverent ways rather than boisterous outbursts. The presence or even the thought of women could ignite desire, a distraction that threatened their entire spiritual path. This fear was reflected in strict rules, forbidding monks from interacting with women, except in very controlled circumstances, such as nuns from nearby convents or female servants. Even then, these encounters were to be brief and purposeful, never social or intimate. The Church's teachings often portrayed women as temptresses and sources of sin, reinforcing the monks' need for vigilance, and all manner of distractions that could pull one away from a life of prayer and contemplation. Monks were warned that even a short visit to town could lead to temptation and sin. Stories circulated within the monastic community about brothers who had fallen because they dared to venture beyond the cloister's safety. The fear of losing one's spiritual focus was real and pervasive. The flesh represented human desires and weaknesses. The world embodied secular life with its temptations. And the devil was the spiritual adversary, constantly seeking to lead souls astray. Within this framework, the monastery was a spiritual fortress, a refuge from these dangers, where monks could focus solely on God. Stepping outside this protective boundary was seen as risking spiritual ruin. Monks were taught to fear the outside world in all its forms, the bustling towns filled with distractions, the allure of women, the seductive sounds of music, and even laughter itself. This was not simply about avoiding worldly pleasures. It was a fundamental part of the monastic belief system that saw the secular world as a realm of corruption, distraction, and moral peril. To survive in the cloister, monks had to accept strict rules that shaped every aspect of their thoughts, emotions, and actions. The teaching that the outside world was sinful was deeply embedded in the monastic mindset. Towns and cities, with their noise, crowds, and profane behaviors, were especially feared. Women were perhaps the most potent symbol of worldly temptation in the medieval monk's worldview. Music and laughter, common in the secular world, were also viewed with suspicion. The psychological impact of this strict separation from the outside world was profound. Yet, despite the harshness of these rules and the fear of the outside, monks were human and often wrestled with their own desires and doubts. The monastic writings of the time reveal a complex relationship with the outside world. The strict separation was also practical. The outside world was not only spiritually dangerous, but often physically unsafe. In summary, the message was clear. The outside world was a realm of sin, temptation, and danger. Death was an ever-present reality within the walls of a medieval monastery. Though monks dedicated their lives to prayer and the hope of salvation, the end of their earthly journey was never taken lightly. In fact, the way death was approached, managed, and remembered in the monastery reflected the deep spiritual beliefs, rituals, and anxieties of medieval Christian life. To live as a monk was to live with death close by, and to die was to face a profound transition one that combined quiet solemnity with the weighty uncertainty of what awaited beyond. The grave was simple, marked sometimes only by a wooden cross or a small stone, underscoring the idea that in death all were equal, regardless of rank or achievement. Medieval monks were acutely aware that death was not simply a passage to guaranteed salvation. The doctrine of purgatory, a place of temporary suffering and purification after death, held a central place in their beliefs. This meant that even after death, the soul might still face trials and purification before reaching heaven. For many, death was the ultimate union with God, the end of earthly suffering, and the beginning of true peace. The monastic life prepared them for this moment through its rhythms of prayer, self-denial, and community support. Monastic burial grounds became places of local importance, sites where families might seek spiritual connection or commemorate loved ones. It was a time for prayer, purification, and reflection on the mysteries of life and afterlife. Though approached with reverence and solemnity, death was never fully conquered. It remained a powerful reminder of human frailty and the eternal questions that defined monastic existence. Understanding how monks face death offers vital insight into their world, a world where silence, devotion, and community met the ultimate transition from this life to the next. The practices developed in monasteries shaped the Christian understanding of death rites, funerals, and memorials for centuries. Yet the journey to death was not easy, and the monks' writings often reveal a mixture of hope, fear, resignation, and faith. The uncertainty of the soul's final destiny weighed heavily on many monks, coloring their prayers and daily practices. The passing of a brother meant the community lost a member who contributed to daily work, prayer, and social life. New novices would be trained to fill the gaps, and the order's routines would continue, underscoring the enduring nature of the monastic institution, even as individual lives ended. The emphasis was on returning to the earth humbly, following the Christian teaching of dust to dust. The community engaged in what were called suffrages, prayers and masses intended to aid the soul's passage through purgatory. Monks were constantly reminded through sermons, readings, and the presence of death in their midst that life was fleeting, and that they must live in constant vigilance and repentance. The graveyard was a silent teacher, a place of meditation on mortality and the eternal. Monks would visit the graves of their brothers, meditate on death, and renew their commitment to the spiritual path. Monasteries often kept records of the dead and offered ongoing prayers for them, seeing this as a vital act of charity and spiritual solidarity. The bonds formed in life extended beyond death, with monks interceding for each other and the wider community. The community would gather for a funeral service, which included psalms, prayers for the soul, and sometimes a mass dedicated to the deceased. When a monk's health began to fail, and it became clear that death was near, the monastery shifted into a state of focused preparation. This was not a moment marked by drama or loud mourning, but rather by quiet reverence and ritual. The dying monk would be surrounded by brothers who offered prayers, comfort, and spiritual guidance. The belief in the power of prayer at the moment of death was strong, with the hope that the last hours could be a time of purification, repentance, and readiness for the afterlife. Monks would often be encouraged to confess their sins, seek forgiveness, and recite prayers or scripture. The physical environment of death within the monastery was simple and austere. There was no room for display or ostentation. Instead, the emphasis was on humility and acceptance. The body was prepared for burial in a way consistent with the order's values of simplicity and modesty. There were no elaborate coffins or grand ceremonies. Rather, the monk would be washed and wrapped in a plain shroud, reflecting the vow of poverty taken in life. This act of washing was itself a sacred ritual, symbolizing purification and readiness to meet God. The monk's cell, often a bare stone room, became the place of passing, its cold walls witnessing the final moments. The other brothers might take turns keeping vigil, reading from sacred texts or chanting softly to ease the dying man's soul toward peace. The silence of the cloister was broken only by whispered prayers and the rhythmic sound of monastic chant. Once death occurred, the monastery followed carefully prescribed rituals designed to honor the departed and aid their soul's journey. Burial usually took place within the monastery grounds, often in a communal graveyard or a designated area reserved for the brothers. Despite the outward calm of these rites, the spiritual reality of death remained deeply complex and at times frightening. This uncertainty also influenced how the living monks prayed for their dead. Death in the monastery was also a moment of reflection on the fragility of life and the importance of spiritual readiness. While death was solemn and often feared, it was also sometimes seen as a release from the hardships of monastic life. In addition to the spiritual and communal aspects, death in the monastery had practical consequences. The monastery's attitude toward death also influenced wider medieval culture. In summary, death in the medieval monastery was a moment marked by quiet ritual, deep spiritual significance, and profound uncertainty. The life of a medieval monk was one marked by extremes: silence, discipline, austerity, and self-denial. It was a path chosen or sometimes forced by those who sought spiritual purity and salvation through withdrawal from the world's temptations. But as we look back on this existence, filled with endless prayers, cold stone cells, and rigorous routines, a question lingers. Did this harsh life truly bring peace? Historical records, letters, and monastic writings reveal a complex picture, one that includes moments of profound faith and joy, but also frequent struggles with loneliness, doubt, and suffering. Or was it, perhaps, suffering cloaked in the guise of devotion? The vow of silence, while spiritually valuable, often resulted in intense isolation. Yet, these same conditions sometimes led to illness and despair. The sense of community, the shared devotion, and the beauty of chant and scripture could uplift spirits. The monastic libraries and scriptoria offered intellectual engagement, and some monks found fulfillment in copying manuscripts or tending gardens. Fear of sin, fear of damnation, and fear of failing God's expectations were constant companions. For monks, peace was less about comfort and more about spiritual victory over the self. It was about aligning one's entire being with divine will, even at great personal cost. In this light, the suffering was not senseless, but a form of sacrifice, a way to participate in Christ's own passion and to prepare the soul for eternal life. This spiritual anxiety complicated the pursuit of peace, making it a goal that was as much about avoiding punishment as it was about seeking joy. Some historical accounts tell of those who struggled to reconcile their faith with the harshness of monastic life, questioning whether true peace was attainable in such conditions. I'll be sharing many more stories that bring the past to life in vivid, thoughtful ways. Living a life of cold stone cells, strict discipline, and endless prayer was far from easy. And as we've seen, and ring the notification bell, so you want to miss future explorations into history's most compelling stories. Your support means the world and helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep curious and keep exploring history's hidden corners. I love bringing these forgotten worlds to light, and there are so much more ahead, stories that reveal the human experience in all its raw and rich detail. The pursuit of peace in such a world was as much about enduring suffering as it was about finding spiritual solace. Whether it truly brought peace or simply masked hardship, the monk's life remains a powerful example of dedication, sacrifice, and the complexities of faith. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep wondering about the lives that shaped our world. If peace is defined narrowly as the absence of suffering, then medieval monasticism might seem a failure. But if peace is seen as a spiritual state of grace, achieved through struggle and perseverance, then the monastic life represents a profound, if difficult, path toward that ideal. Others found comfort in the rituals and community, but longed for the freedoms of the outside world. The tension between devotion and desire, between discipline and individuality, was a constant theme. The confessional, penances, and strict observance of rules reflected a mindset that viewed human nature as deeply flawed and in need of constant correction. For those who truly believed in their vocation, the sacrifices were meaningful and purposeful, a path to eternal salvation that justified earthly hardships. It shows us that peace is not always gentle or easy, but often hard-won through discipline, sacrifice, and faith. For some, undoubtedly, yes, a peace rooted in faith and spiritual purpose that transcended earthly hardship. For others, it was a life marked by struggle and suffering, where peace remained elusive. Perhaps this very tension is what makes the monastic journey both challenging and profoundly human. For many monks, the harshness of their daily lives was a necessary path to a deeper, lasting peace beyond the reach of worldly troubles. The question arises, did such self-inflicted suffering bring them closer to peace, or did it only deepen their trials? Not all monks joined willingly. Some were placed in monasteries as children, or sent by families seeking to remove them from secular life. For these individuals, monasticism might have been a prison rather than a sanctuary. The loss of personal freedom, the vow of obedience, the renunciation of family ties and worldly possessions could weigh heavily. The stone cells were cold and barren, and monks had little to occupy their minds beyond prayer and work. Such conditions could wear down even the most committed. Many monks recorded feelings of spiritual dryness or aridity, a sense that God's presence was distant or absent despite their efforts. This dark night of the soul, as it later came to be known, was a deeply challenging experience that tested the resolve of the faithful. The monks believed that through such discipline, the distractions of the secular world could be overcome, leading to a clearer union with God. The rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential monastic guides, emphasized obedience, humility, and stability as key to achieving this peace. For many monks, the rhythm of the divine office prayers, said at regular intervals throughout the day and night, provided a comforting structure that shaped their entire existence. To begin to answer this, we must understand what peace meant in the medieval monastic context. For monks, peace was not simply the absence of noise or hardship. It was a profound spiritual tranquility, a state of harmony with God, free from the turmoil of earthly desires and distractions. The monk's entire way of life was designed to strip away everything that might disrupt this peace. Silence was not merely quiet. It was a discipline meant to silence the restless thoughts and sinful impulses that could pull the soul away from God. Physical hardship was embraced as a form of penance, a way to purify the body and mind. Yet the question remains, did this spiritual ideal translate into genuine peace, or was it an unattainable aspiration that left many monks caught in cycles of frustration and despair? The rigorous monastic schedule, with its endless cycle of prayers, work, and silence, was intended to cultivate inner stillness and focus. At the same time, the severity of the monastic life could be crushing. Physical deprivation was another source of suffering. Monks often endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion, embracing these hardships as part of their spiritual journey. There were certainly moments when monks found joy and solace in their lives. On the other hand, the relentless demands of a monastic rule could foster resentment or a feeling of entrapment. Moreover, the ideal of peace in monasticism was often intertwined with fear. Modern perspectives might view this lifestyle as austere or even harsh, but it is essential to see it through the lens of medieval spirituality. Still, not all monks found this path fulfilling. The question of whether the monastic life brought peace also depends on how one defines peace itself. In the end, the legacy of medieval monasticism teaches us about the complexity of human spirituality. So, did the life of silence, denial, and discipline bring true peace? If you enjoyed diving into the hidden world of medieval monks and want to explore more fascinating histories, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the harsh, silent world of medieval monks. If you found this journey into medieval monastic life fascinating, don't forget to subscribe. Please leave a comment below, sharing what surprised you most about the life of a monk, or what you'd like to learn about next.